Our last speaker in this session is Brett Rickard. He is the Ruth and William Morgan Associate Professor in the Charles Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management at Cornell University. His work is specifically focused on food and agriculture economics with special interest in addressing contemporary marketing and policy issues in the specialty crop markets. His talk is on modeling the nutritional implications of food waste mitigation. Brett.
Thank you, Christina. And thank you to the Academy for inviting me to be a part of this panel. My talk, Norbert, do you still have the, this is it. My talk is going to follow up a little bit on the things that Norbert was finishing with. And I want to look, we spent some time today and yesterday thinking about the cost of food waste. You see these $200 billion, and we see a little bit of talk about the quantity of food wasted. And I'm interested in both of those, but I'm also interested in how those translate into the nutrients that are lost as a result of food waste, and what might be the implications if there was improvements or changes in food waste. This is work I'm doing with a grad student, Shui Sear, and a colleague, Abigail, who used to work at the ERS, and now she has recently taken a job at the National Science Foundation. So I thought it's useful for me, I hope this is useful for you, to start with a broad overview of what economists are studying in this space in food waste. And I'm not sure, this is just my interpretation, but there's these four areas or these four buckets where there's work being done by economists as it relates to food waste. And the first one is about measuring. So that's economists trying to better understand how much food is wasted. Okay, and there's a pretty active debate about what is the amount that's wasted and what is defined as waste. I've given you some papers to follow up on if that's of interest. The second one I call information and industry initiatives. This I would put Norbert's work in this bucket. And Norbert's done some really good work here. He's trying to understand, if there's some behavioral nudges in the world that might help people reduce their food waste, what's the effect of those nudges and how would it affect their food waste? And it differs across different food categories, different food products. And the messaging can matter too. Norbert started to talk about the best buy and the use by and the best if used by. Sort of those different messages also can influence behavioral changes. There's a pretty rigorous debate also about this question of the optimal level of food waste by economists. There's a lot of economists that would argue that zero food waste maybe isn't the optimal amount of food waste because there's such great costs to get you to zero food waste that those costs may exceed the value of the food that you're no longer wasting. And Brenna, who presented yesterday about labels, has been part of that debate. You can see she's had a recent paper with her colleague Jason Lusk. And then this fourth bucket is the one I've become more interested in, and it's kind of this next step question. So if we are able to reduce food waste, whatever insert magic weapon here, then what? Then what happens to prices? Then what happens to quantities? Do prices in the supermarket go down if we collectively reduce food waste? Do they go down more for some products than other products? What happens to prices at the farm if those surplus tomatoes are brought into the market? I think that could have some economic consequences in farm markets and in food markets. And then, if I'm allowed to, go one step further to think about, what are the nutritional implications if you and I change our food waste patterns, if we change what's available in our household, does it change what we eat? And there's also some papers, and Brenna, once again, she's very scholarly in this area, and she has, but these are really just thought pieces. They don't offer answers, and so that's what I'm going to try to do in this project. The goal here is to develop, and we have been developing this framework to think about how changes in food waste or food loss might affect prices and quantities. How would those affect the nutrients that are available in the household? Okay? So if some food category, if we were to waste less of it, how would that affect the quantity of that food group in our house, and how would that affect the nutrients that are associated with that food group? I think this is partly, or maybe in a bigger way, motivated by these nice pictures that the ERS has produced, and I see people use these. This is a picture that that takes that $200 billion and breaks it up into these food groups by percentage terms or by billions of dollars, right? So when you look at that, you say most of the dollars of food waste can be attributed to fruits and vegetables, dairy, meat. But when you look at the calories that are wasted, you take that same pie, but now instead of dollar terms or quantity terms, you convert it to nutrients, and you see that the lion's share of nutrients that we waste are added fats and added sugars. So part of me worries that if we were to reduce food waste, is that going to reduce waste of this big area, and we're going to, in fact, sort of reconstruct our diet so that we're eating more of these? Part of me thinks that at least we're wasting the right things now, right? And if we were to somehow, this is sort of this question about unintended consequences. If we were to reduce food waste, are we going to inadvertently sort of direct us towards eating more of the bad things? So the contribution here, I think the contribution here is twofold. One, we're trying to add some information to that second bucket. How do people respond to these behavioral nudges? And then second, what are the larger sort of market effects of such a change in food waste, food consumption patterns? So we have a survey, an experiment, where we ask consumers, many consumers, how would these behavioral nudges, if we were to use a different date label, how would it affect their likelihood to discard? So I think, I didn't realize that, but I'm not using the word food waste in this survey, not because of what because I did this before Tom had his talk yesterday. But in the same vein, sometimes it's not wise to ask consumers in a survey about food waste because there's a negative connotation associated with that. So we used this idea, likelihood to discard. And we did this one day past the due date. We did this for 15 different products, so that's also, I think, a contribution that we were doing this across a large suite of food and beverage products. And we looked at a variety of these date-labeled treatments. So we include the use by, best by, sell by, best if, used by. And then we also included, we haven't talked about this, or maybe you did yesterday before I came, we included some smart labels. So these are labels that identify the freshness of the product. And I think I have a picture that I'll show you that maybe I did see this picture yesterday that Sainsbury is using. And then we use the results from the survey to think about these questions. How would behavioral changes affect prices and quantities, and how would it affect the nutrients that are available in our household? Would it affect what's available, what we eat? Okay? So these are the 15 products that we include in our survey. We ask people about their likelihood to discard those 15 products, and we use those strategically because they feed into these 9 food groups that we often think about when we're modeling food systems in agricultural economics. They feed into cereal, meat, eggs, fruits and vegetables, dairy, beverages, other foods, plus alcohol and food away from home. So I'm collecting information on the first 7, but I include all 9 in this larger model. Does this make sense? The 10 treatments. So everyone in this experiment, everyone in this survey was in the control treatment. And this is a treatment where they saw a date, but there was no text associated with it. There was no best by, used by. It was just the date, and we asked them what's their likelihood of discarding a product with just the date. This mimics a bit from what Norbert was explaining earlier. And then each subject also was in one of the subsequent treatments where there was language associated with a date. So someone could be in the control, they saw the date for a product, and they said, what's your likelihood of discarding? And then they would later in the survey be asked similar question, how much would you discard of this product? But now we would highlight that it was best by the day, and the day was always yesterday, one day past the due date. We have these biosensor treatments as well. I think I did see this picture yesterday with the ham, we used a slightly different logo, but it's the same idea. There could be a biosensor that tells us the product is still fresh. It's fresh, still fresh, past fresh. I'll show you in a minute the exact. And we use these biosensors in conjunction with words. So the biosensor plus used by, the biosensor plus best if used by. Okay? So for instance, if someone took our survey, they would see this control. Everyone would, and this was done almost 1 year ago. And the other thing we didn't do is we didn't use any brands or any pictures. We tried to throw it back to the consumer or to the subject, and they would just imagine the 32-ounce container of orange juice that they typically buy, hoping that that would, without the use of brands or pictures, that it wouldn't steer them in one direction. We asked them how likely are you to just discard all of this product due to the label above, just the date label, and they would tell us on this Likert scale how likely they would be. And then later in the survey, they would see this, 32 ounces of orange juice, and then they would see the best if used by, same date, but then they would have this additional information. In this case, in this example, it was the biosensor treatment, where it could be purple would be past fresh, blue would be less fresh, and green would be fresh. And in this particular case, we're saying best if used by yesterday, but we're giving you this additional information from the biosensor that it is fresh. It's green, okay? Sort of mimicking that logo that we saw on the ham, packaged ham from Sainsbury. And again, asking this question, how likely they are to discard. And here is some very general summary statistics from this survey, okay? This is combining all 15 products into an average amount. But it's interesting even at this broad level. You can see the likelihood to discard going from extremely likely to extremely unlikely. In the control, sometimes I like to put a box around this. So in the control, you can see if you were to think about these two likely categories together, there's about 27% likely that you would discard that product or that average of those 15 products when you just saw the date. Right? And then when you saw the date plus Best Buy, then you become sort of 22% likely to discard those products on average. And when you saw the green circle plus the best if used by, you are 18% likely to discard the average of those 15 products. Okay, so you can see that there is some sort of behavioral change. This follows up to what Norbert and I have done in other experiments and some of the things he explained earlier, that there is this change. And what I'm going to show you next is that this change wasn't the same for all 15 products. Okay? Some of those products were more influenced by this language than others, and it depended on the product and it depended on the language. Okay? And because those products are built from different bundles of nutrients, it also affects the nutrient profile or the nutrient availability in the household. So here is an idea of how this is working. So we have this survey that I explained in the red. We're using that to try to parameterize these changes that could happen in the household. You could think of them as shocks or changes in retail demand for these 15 foods, which we can aggregate into these 7, which go into these 9 different food groups that we typically think of as households consuming. Those changes will induce changes in prices and retail quantities for those different food products. And since we know quite a bit, since many people in this room know quite a bit about the nutrient profile of those food groups, we can say something about the nutrient availability in the households as a result of these behavioral changes. I'm not going to talk about this today, but I'm also quite interested in how this would ripple back to the farm and how that would affect farm prices and quantities. You could even think of a different policy, not the changes in date labels, but you could think of, say in that red, we did something, this gleaning, it could be a policy that enabled gleaning. That would be a different type of shock to the system that would more directly affect the farm side of things. And that could also lead to changes in farm level quantities and prices if there was some mechanism to help foster, enable gleaning. So this general framework can be used to solve different types of questions, different problems. But today, the shock is these changes in retail demand as a result of people paying better attention or being motivated by these changes in date labels. So here's some results, some simulation results on the nutrition side. Okay, I don't think I have enough time to go through the prices and the quantities, and I think the nutrition is maybe of more interest to me and hopefully to you as well. So this is sort of at the end of that sequence. I'm going to go through some results from this box, but these results come directly from results from a previous box, but I'm not going to focus on those today. So I normally tell my students, don't present a slide with a bunch of numbers in 10-point font, but I guess I break my own rules. But this, I'm trying to give you a sense that in those rows are the various nutrients, the micronutrients and the macronutrients that many of us are interested in. And across the top, those columns are these 9 different food groups that we typically think of. And so this particular table is telling us what would happen nutritionally if we were to shift to this Best By date label, right, across these 15 different products. It would change the caloric intake. Basically, we're going to waste less food, so then we're going to buy less food. We're going to buy less of some foods than other foods because now we're not wasting as much, we're consuming more, so we don't have to purchase as much food, right? So retail quantities fall. We see most, if not all, of these nutrient bundles falling, but you'll see them falling in different proportions because some of the products are impacted more than others. So that's a lot of numbers, and it's hard sometimes to think about, what does a calcium reduction of 330, 100 milligrams, I forget the unit of measurement here. So anyways, this is hard for me to think about. So I converted it to this bar chart. And for me, this is easier to think about and easier to explain to an audience. So here's the one. The one, to me, would be the tipping point, right? This is a picture that describes the relative availability of these nutrients in the household if people saw the Best By date label. If people saw this Best By date label across these 15 products, they would have a household with relatively more cholesterol, more protein, more calcium in that household. Okay? The relative availability of nutrients in that household would shift towards cholesterol. Fat, you'll notice, is a little bigger than 1. The protein, the vitamin A is bigger than 1. The relative bundle of nutrients would shift towards these. And that's because Best By has a bigger impact on waste of dairy and meat products. And so people would say, I'm not going to waste the meat and dairy products, and then the relative availability of nutrients would shift towards those. And it would shift away. The household would have a relatively fewer carbohydrates and sugars as a result of this Best By label. Does that make sense? Is the bar chart more helpful than the... And I've also done this for the best if used by, and it's a very similar story. It's a similar story, but it's even more like the previous one. The bars for cholesterol, for protein, for fat are bigger in this one. People were even more responsive to their waste for protein, fat-oriented food products than in the Best By. And again, the relative availability of sugar and carbohydrates would decrease as a result of people paying better attention to these. So I'm going to add to what Norbert said. Some of these date labels work. So consumers do respond to some of these date labels. It seems to be Best By, Sell By, and the biosensors. People pay attention to those. But it's not the same level of response for all the 15 food items. Okay? Some of these food items respond much more to these date labels than others. If government was able to improve date label information, we show, I think pretty clearly, that this would disproportionately decrease waste, discard rates of certain food products which are linked to certain nutrients. Okay? And then this would lead to this general availability of what's available in your household, what's available in your pantry and your kitchen would shift towards things that have more fat, cholesterol, protein, and away from things that have more carbohydrates and sugar. I think that's all I want to say. You know what? I have this picture. I thought Norbert would show it. There's this poster over at the USDA building across the way, and it's from maybe 1910. And they remind us not to waste food a long time ago, so this is not a new topic, but I think it's equally important. So I'll stop there. Thank you.